Concrete floors leach heat faster than a human body can generate it. Nora learned this, pressing her cheek against the basement drain, inhaling the sharp scent of bleach layered over old copper. A heavy, rhythmic tapping echoed from the stairs, leather soles hitting hollow wood. Most men in his position demanded respect. Cassian demanded a total psychological collapse. When her vocal cords finally gave out from screaming for a god that wasn't there, he merely tilted his head, exhaled a plume of grey cigar smoke, and whispered that she sounded absolutely perfect. Dust cooked on the surface of the single halogen bulb dangling above Nora's head. It smelled like burning hair and hot metal. She was shivering, a violent, uncontrollable rattling that started in her jaw and vibrated down to the cheap plastic zip ties biting into her wrists. She didn't look defiant. She didn't feel brave. She felt an urgent, pathetic need to empty her bladder, her stomach churning with the sour aftertaste of the gas station coffee she'd drank hours before they threw a burlap sack over her head. The chair she was tied to was an old metal folding chair. One of the rubber feet was missing, making it wobble every time she gasped for air. Footsteps. Heavy, unhurried. The heavy steel door groaned on dry hinges, scraping against the uneven concrete floor. Nora flinched, squeezing her eyes shut. Don't look at them. If you don't look at them, they aren't real. A childish defense mechanism, completely useless in the face of the men who had dragged her out of her apartment over a debt she didn't even borrow. Her brother, Leo, had borrowed it. Leo was currently in Florida. Nora was here. Look at me. The voice wasn't a bark. It wasn't rough or gravelly like the enforcers who had shoved her into the trunk of a sedan. It was smooth, conversational, almost bored. Nora kept her eyes shut. Tears squeezed through her lashes, hot and stinging, cutting tracks through the grime on her face. Please, she croaked. Her throat was already raw from sobbing in the trunk. I don't have it. I don't know where he is. I swear to God I'll pay it back. I can get a second job. I said, look at me. The tone dropped half an octave. It didn't get louder. It got denser. The air in the room seemed to compress around it. Nora opened her eyes. The harsh halogen light stung her retinas, leaving floating purple spots in her vision. Through the glare, she saw him. Cassian. He didn't look like a cartel boss. He didn't look like a thug. He looked like a hedge fund manager who had just stepped out of a high-end tailor's shop. His suit was a dark, muted charcoal, the fabric falling perfectly over his broad shoulders without a single crease. His tie was loosened just a fraction. He smelled of expensive sandalwood soap, starched cotton, and a faint, sharp undertone of gunpowder. He pulled a second folding chair from the corner, the metal legs shrieking against the floor, and sat down backward, crossing his arms over the top of the backrest. He stared at her. His eyes were a pale, washed-out blue, devoid of warmth, devoid of anger. They were the eyes of a biologist looking through a microscope. You're shaking, Cassian observed. Nora tried to stop. She clamped her jaw shut until her teeth ground together, but the tremor only worsened. Please, she whispered again, the word slipping out like a reflex. She was a mess. Her nose was running, snot mixing with tears and sweat. She sniffled violently, embarrassed and terrified. I have 4,000 in savings. You can take it. Take my car. It's a Honda, but it runs fine. Just don't hurt me. Please don't hurt me. She was begging. She had thought, watching movies, that if she were ever in this situation, she'd retain some dignity. She'd spit in her captor's face. In reality, dignity was the first thing to evaporate. She would have licked the grime off his expensive leather Oxfords if he told her it would let her walk out that door. Cassian didn't answer. He reached into his inner jacket pocket and pulled out a silver case. A soft snick echoed in the room as he opened it, extracting a thin cigar. He lit it with a matte black lighter. The smell of rich, sweet tobacco filled the damp air, momentarily overpowering the bleach. "Tell me, Nora," he said, exhaling a thin stream of smoke that drifted lazily toward the hot bulb. "When Leo took my money, did he tell you he was using your name as collateral? Or did he forge your signature?" "He forged it," she babbled, leaning forward as far as the zip ties would allow, desperate to make him believe her. "I swear, I didn't know until the bank called. I haven't spoken to him in months. He's a junkie. He lies to everyone. You have to believe me." She was throwing her own brother under the bus. She didn't care. She just wanted to live. Cassian watched her frantic nodding. He watched the way the tendons in her neck strained, the way her pupils were blown wide with pure, unadulterated panic. He leaned in slightly. "I do believe you." Nora sagged. A massive, shuddering breath escaped her lips. "Thank you. Oh my God, thank you. I can get you the rest, I promise. Just give me a payment plan." "But," Cassian interrupted softly, "Leo isn't here, and a debt requires balancing. The ledger demands it." The coldness in his voice snapped the fragile thread of hope Nora had just grasped. Her stomach bottomed out. The sour coffee rushed up her esophagus. She dry heaved, twisting her head to the side, gagging on nothing but acid and bile. It splattered onto the concrete. She expected disgust. She expected him to hit her. Instead, Cassian leaned closer. He watched her heave, watched the spittle hang from her cracked lips. His pale eyes tracked the violent spasms of her ribcage. He wasn't repulsed. He was captivated. "No!" Nora whimpered, her voice cracking. "No, no, no! Help!" The scream tore out of her throat before she could process it. It was loud, feral, and deafening in the small concrete box. "Help! Somebody help me!" She thrashed against the chair. The plastic ties bit into her skin, slicing the top layer, letting hot, thin lines of blood trickle down her palms. She screamed until her throat felt like it was lined with shattered glass. She screamed until black spots danced at the edges of her vision. She screamed for a rescue she knew wasn't coming, and Cassian just sat there. He didn't cover his ears. He didn't tell her to shut up. He closed his eyes for a brief second, his chest rising in a slow, deep breath, taking in the sound of her absolute despair, the way another man might listen to a cello. When Nora finally choked on her own breath, dissolving into a fit of coughing and wheezing, Cassian opened his eyes. A subtle shift had occurred in his posture. The boredom was gone. "Again," he whispered. Time lost its rigid structure. It melted into a sequence of physiological reactions. The drying of her mouth, the cramping of her calves, the throb of the plastic cutting her wrists. The halogen bulb continued its low electronic buzz. Nora hung her head, her chin resting on her collarbone. Her chest heaved with shallow, erratic breaths. She couldn't scream anymore. Every attempt resulted in a dry, painful hiss. Her vocal cords felt bruised, swollen, tight. Cassian hadn't moved from the chair opposite her. The cigar was gone, stamped out neatly on the concrete by his immaculate shoe. He had spent the last hour doing nothing but watching her break down. He hadn't touched her. He hadn't threatened her with a weapon. He had simply let the silence and the setting do the work, prompting her with a single word whenever she started to quiet down. Again. It was a sick, twisted game, and she was losing her mind. "Water," she rasped, the word barely legible. Her tongue felt like sandpaper dragging against the roof of her mouth. Cassian stood up. The movement was so sudden, so fluid, that Nora flinched violently, knocking the chair backward. She caught herself just before it tipped over, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. He walked over to a small metal table in the corner that Nora hadn't noticed. There was a plastic cooler on it. The sound of a latch clicking, the rustle of ice. The sensory details were magnified in the quiet room. She heard the twist of a plastic cap. He walked back and stood over her. The proximity was suffocating. He smelled like mint now, and that underlying metallic scent of gunpowder. He held a cold bottle of water. Condensation beaded on the plastic, dripping down onto his knuckles. Nora stared at the water, her lips parted instinctively. Cassian didn't bring it to her mouth. He held it just out of reach. "You have an incredible capacity for panic," he said, his voice dropping into that low, dense register. "Most people shut down. They disassociate. They go quiet. But you stay present. You fight it. You throw everything you have against the walls of the cage." "Please," she mouthed. The word was a puff of air. He tilted the bottle. A splash of freezing water hit the dirty concrete floor, mere inches from her sneakers. Nora sobbed, a wet, pathetic sound. It wasn't defiant. It was the sound of an animal that realized the trap wasn't going to open. "I'll do anything," she croaked. "Please, just tell me what you want. I'll do anything." Cassian squatted down so he was eye level with her. Up close, his skin was flawless, his jawline sharp enough to cut glass. There was a terrifying stillness to him. Normal people fidgeted. They shifted their weight, blinked rapidly, breathed heavily. Cassian existed in a state of perfectly calibrated, low idle. He reached out. Nora squeezed her eyes shut and braced for a strike. Instead, she felt the cool, dry pads of his fingers against her jawline. The touch was agonizingly gentle, which somehow made it infinitely worse. It wasn't a caress. He was pressing his fingertips against the carotid artery in her neck. He was feeling her pulse. 140 beats per minute, he murmured, his thumb brushing against the frantic fluttering beneath her skin. "Maybe 150. Your sympathetic nervous system is flooded. Cortisol, adrenaline. You feel like you're dying." "I am dying," she choked out, opening her eyes to look at him. She hated him. The hatred was a small, hot coal, burning beneath the mountain of her terror. But she was entirely at his mercy, and the contradiction made her dizzy. "You're not dying," Cassian corrected softly. "You're just very, very awake." He pressed his thumb down slightly harder, momentarily restricting the blood flow. Panic flared anew in Nora's chest. She thrashed, a sudden, violent spasm of pure survival instinct. She kicked out, her sneaker connecting weakly with his shin. Cassian didn't even flinch. He let go of her neck, his eyes dilating slightly. The pupils swallowed the pale blue irises until his eyes looked almost black. A faint, almost imperceptible muscle ticked in his jaw. It was the first sign of genuine emotion she had seen from him, and it terrified her more than the stoicism. It looked like hunger. "There it is," he whispered, a strange reverence in his tone. The struggle. He stood up, towering over her again. He unscrewed the cap of the water bottle and tipped it against her cracked lips. Nora drank greedily, gagging as she swallowed too fast, water spilling down her chin and soaking the collar of her cheap cotton t-shirt. She choked, sputtering, but chased the bottle as he pulled it away. "Your brother's debt is $30,000, Cassian said, casually, screwing the cap back on. "A trivial amount. I spend more on watches I never wear," Nora coughed, catching her breath. "Then why?" "Because a ledger is a ledger," he replied, turning to place the bottle back on the table. "And because I was bored. And then, my men brought you in." He turned back to her, slipping his hands into his trouser pockets. He surveyed her ruined state, the bloodied wrists, the tear-stained face, the trembling frame. "I don't care about the money anymore, Nora." The way he said her name made the hairs on her arms stand up. It was intimate. It felt like a violation. "Then let me go," she whispered, a fresh wave of tears blurring her vision. Cassian smiled. It was a small, razor-thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. "No, I don't think I will. I think I'm going to keep you. You make a fascinating noise when you break." He walked toward the heavy steel door. "Dominic!" he called out, his voice returning to its normal, conversational volume. The door scraped open. A massive, bearded man stepped into the frame, glaring at Nora. "Cut her loose!" Cassian ordered, stepping past the brute into the dimly lit hallway. "Clean her up, and put her in the guest room on the top floor. Lock the door from the outside." "The guest room, sir?" Dominic asked, a flicker of confusion crossing his thick features. "You heard me," Cassian said, his voice fading as he walked away. "She's an investment now." The sensory whiplash was enough to induce vertigo. Nora woke up with a gasp, her hands flying to her throat. She expected the coarse bite of the zip ties. Instead, her fingers brushed against her own skin, unhindered. She was lying on a mattress, not a cot, not a thin foam pad. A mattress so thick and soft it felt like it was trying to swallow her whole. She pushed herself up into a sitting position, her heart doing a familiar, panicked stutter step. The room was vast. Floor-to-ceiling windows made up the entire far wall, though they were currently obscured by heavy, slate-grey blackout curtains. The floor was dark, polished hardwood. The walls were a cool, sterile white, devoid of art or photographs. It looked like a luxury hotel room stripped of all personality. The smell of bleach and old copper was gone. Here, the air was conditioned, smelling faintly of lavender laundry detergent and expensive lemon furniture polish. Nora looked down. She was no longer wearing her jeans and her cheap t-shirt. Someone had dressed her in an oversized, incredibly soft, dark grey cashmere sweater and a pair of matching lounge pants. The realization that someone, Dominic, or maybe some nameless maid, had stripped her unconscious body made her stomach roll with violation. She swung her legs over the side of the bed. Her bare feet touched the cold wood. Her wrists were bandaged with crisp, white gauze. "Run!" The instinct was loud, drumming in her ears. She scrambled to the heavy oak door on the opposite side of the room. She grabbed the brushed steel handle and yanked. Locked. Solid. No give. She slammed her fists against the wood. "Hey!" she croaked. Her voice was still ravaged from the basement. "Hey, let me out! Let me out of here!" She hit the door until the sides of her hands bruised, but the wood was thick, swallowing the sound. She turned her attention to the windows. She ran across the room and hauled the heavy curtains back. Light flooded the room, blinding her for a second. When her eyes adjusted, her breath hitched. She was high up. The sprawling grid of a city stretched out below her, choked with evening traffic, the brake lights bleeding into long red ribbons. She was in a penthouse, and the glass was thick. She pressed her forehead against it. It didn't vibrate with the wind. It was reinforced. Bulletproof, probably. She was in a fishbowl in the sky. Nora slid down the glass, pulling her knees to her chest, and buried her face in her arms. She didn't scream this time. There was no point. The cold realization of her new reality settled over her like a lead apron. Her begging hadn't worked, or rather it had worked too well. It hadn't repulsed him. It had entertained him. Her fear was the only currency she had left, and she had just spent it all to buy herself a cage with a better view. A click. The quiet snick of a lock turning. Nora scrambled backward, pushing herself against the glass, her pulse spiking instantly. The door swung inward. Cassian stood in the threshold. He had lost the suit jacket and the tie. He wore a crisp white dress shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, revealing forearms corded with lean muscle and a smattering of faded, pale scars. He held a silver tray. He walked in, ignoring her terrified posture against the window, and set the tray down on a low glass coffee table in the center of the room. "You slept for 14 hours, he said, not looking at her, as he lifted a silver dome off a plate. The smell of seared meat filled the room. "Your body was exhausted from the adrenaline dump." Nora didn't move. Her mouth watered traitorously at the smell of the food, but her throat was tight with fear. The internal contradiction made her feel pathetic. She was a captive, yet her biology was demanding she eat the steak he brought her. "Come eat," Cassian said. It wasn't a request. Nora slowly got to her feet. Her legs felt like hollow reeds. She kept her back to the window, edging around the perimeter of the room, putting as much distance between them as possible before arriving at the opposite side of the coffee table. There was a prime cut of ribeye on the plate, seared perfectly on the outside. A fork and a dull butter knife rested next to it. No sharp objects. "Sit," he instructed. She sat on the edge of the sleek, modern sofa. Cassian took a seat in an armchair across from her. He crossed his legs, resting his elbows on the armrests, steepling his fingers beneath his chin. He watched her. Nora picked up the fork. Her hand was shaking so badly she dropped it against the plate with a loud clatter. She bit her lip, squeezing her eyes shut, waiting for a reprimand. None came. She picked it up again, using both hands this time to steady it, and sawed off a piece of the meat with the dull knife. It was rare. Blood pooled on the white porcelain. She put it in her mouth and chewed. It tasted like ash, despite the rich fat and salt. Cassian watched her jaw work. He watched the tremor in her hands. "Why am I here?" she asked softly, staring at the bloody meat on her plate. "If you don't care about the money, what do you want?" "I told you," Cassian replied, his voice a low hum in the quiet room. "I want to observe." "Observe what?" "Me eating." "You," he said, leaning forward slightly. "You are a creature of pure survival instinct. In my world, people lie. They posture. They hide their fear behind guns, behind bravado, behind money. But yesterday, in that basement, you stripped all of that away. You gave me something entirely genuine." Nora stopped chewing. The meat felt heavy in her stomach. "You kept me? Because I cried?" "Because you begged," he corrected, his pale blue eyes locking onto hers. "Because when faced with absolute powerlessness, you didn't give up. You broke apart in the most spectacular fashion. And yet you kept trying to put the pieces back together, to bargain with me." It was raw. It was beautiful. Nora felt sick. She pushed the plate away. This wasn't a kidnapping for ransom. This wasn't revenge for a debt. This was an obsession. He was a psychopath, not in the slasher movie sense, but in a clinical, terrifyingly detached way. He lacked empathy, so he simulated the feeling of it by watching her experience extremes. "I can't live like this," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I can't just be your experiment." Cassian stood up slowly. Nora shrank back into the sofa cushions. He walked around the table and stopped directly in front of her. He reached down, and this time, she couldn't stop the flinch. She squeezed her eyes shut. His fingers brushed her hair, tucking a stray strand behind her ear. The touch was freezing. "You say you can't," Cassian murmured, his breath brushing her forehead. But your heart is beating out of your chest right now, Nora. You're terrified. You're anticipating pain. You're alive. You will live like this, because the alternative is the basement. And we both know you don't want to go back there. He pulled his hand away and walked toward the door. Eat your steak, Nora. You'll need your strength. The calibration is only just beginning. The door clicked shut, and the lock turned. Nora was left alone in the sterile silence, the smell of cooked meat and expensive cologne lingering in the air, realizing with bone-chilling clarity that her nightmare hadn't ended in the basement. It had just moved upstairs. 4 days blurred into a single, continuous loop of grey light and aggressive air conditioning. The penthouse guest room was an isolation chamber designed by someone who understood that luxury could be just as maddening as concrete. There were no clocks. The heavy curtains operated on an automated track, sliding open to reveal the sprawling city at what Nora assumed was dawn, and snapping shut when the sky bruised into dusk. The temperature remained a constant, chilly 68 degrees. It kept her wrapped in the oversized cashmere sweater, shivering despite the soft fabric. Sensory deprivation was Cassian's new method. Dominic delivered her meals twice a day on a brushed steel rolling cart. He never spoke. He never made eye contact. He would place a covered silver tray on the glass coffee table, retrieve the tray from the previous meal, and leave. The door would click, the deadbolt would slide into place with a heavy metallic thunk, and the silence would rush back into the room, ringing in her ears. Nora started pacing. She counted the floorboards. 312. She counted the threads woven into the heavy rug beneath the bed. She pressed her face against the cold, reinforced glass of the window, staring down at the microscopic cars crawling along the asphalt, feeling completely unmoored from reality. She wasn't a hostage waiting for a ransom drop. She was a bug in a jar. Cassian visited once every evening. The routine was always the same. The lock would turn, her stomach would plummet, and he would step inside. He didn't ask her how she was. He didn't offer her a book or a television remote. He simply sat in the armchair across from the sofa, crossed his long legs, and watched her. He smelled of bergamot and crisp linen. Nora, by contrast, hadn't showered in days. There was a marble-tiled ensuite bathroom attached to her room, stocked with soaps that smelled of expensive clay and eucalyptus, but she refused to use it. Stripping naked in a space he controlled felt like a vulnerability she couldn't afford. She felt grimy. Her scalp itched. Her mouth tasted like sleep and stale water. During his visits, the contradiction inside her mind grew unbearable. She hated him. She hated the sterile room and the deadbolt, and the way his pale eyes tracked her subtle movements. Yet, after 23 hours of absolute, crushing solitude, the sound of the lock turning sent a spike of sick, twisted relief through her veins. He was a monster, but he was the only living thing that acknowledged she existed. On the 5th evening, she sat on the far edge of the bed, her knees pulled to her chest, picking at a frayed edge of her thumbnail. Cassian sat in his usual spot. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. "Stop," Cassian said. His voice was a physical pressure in the room. Nora froze, her thumb hovering over her index finger. "You're mutilating your nail bed," he observed quietly. "It's a soothing mechanism. Pain to anchor the wandering mind." Nora dropped her hands to her lap. She glared at him, her eyes hot with unshed tears. Her hair was greasy, plastered to the side of her face. "I'm going crazy in here," she croaked. Her voice sounded thin, unused. "You are experiencing a dopamine crash," Cassian replied, unfazed. "Your brain is starved for stimulus. In the basement, you had fear. Fear is highly stimulating. Here, you have nothing. You are adapting. I don't want to adapt. She pushed herself off the bed. Her legs trembled, but she forced herself to stand. She was so tired of feeling small. I want to go home. You know my brother isn't coming back for me. You know you're not getting your money. What is the point of this? Cassian tilted his head. He didn't stand up. He didn't look threatened by her sudden movement. The point is the process, Nora. I am stripping away the societal conditioning. I want to see what is left when you realize nobody is coming. You're a psychopath. A clinical term, he murmured, a faint smirk touching the corner of his mouth. But accurate. I lack the emotional resonance that you possess in such chaotic abundance. You are fascinatingly messy. Nora's chest heaved. The sheer indignity of it all, the sterile room, his clean clothes against her filth, his calm against her panic, snapped something deep in her prefrontal cortex. She didn't think. She just reacted. She lunged toward the glass coffee table where her dinner tray sat untouched. She grabbed the heavy porcelain plate that held her uneaten chicken breast. With a guttural tearing sound in her throat, she hurled it at the wall just right of Cassian's head. The crash was deafening. It shattered the sterile silence like a gunshot. Porcelain exploded into 100 jagged fragments, raining down on the hardwood floor. A smear of brown gravy stained the pristine white paint. Nora stood panting, her chest rising and falling in sharp, jagged jerks. Her hands were shaking so violently she had to clench them into fists to keep from hitting herself. She stared at the mess, the adrenaline spiking, flooding her veins with that hot, electrical hum she hadn't felt since the basement. Cassian hadn't flinched. He hadn't blinked. A small piece of porcelain had bounced off the wall and landed on the shoulder of his dark blazer. He slowly reached up, picked it off between his thumb and forefinger, and set it on the glass table. He looked at the wall. Then he looked at her. "Better?" he asked. Nora's jaw trembled. She wanted him to scream at her. She wanted him to stand up and strike her. Violence she could understand. Violence was a language she could process. This vast, empty calm was terrifying. She dropped to her knees, ignoring the sharp sting as a fragment of porcelain bit through her cashmere lounge pants, scratching her knee. She scrambled through the debris and snatched the largest, sharpest shard. It was shaped like an arrowhead, slick with grease. She scrambled backward until her back hit the bed frame. She held the jagged edge out in front of her, pointing it toward him. Her breathing was ragged, wet sounds tearing from her throat. "Let me out!" she demanded. Her voice cracked, pitching upward into hysteria. "Unlock the door and let me walk out of here, right now!" Cassian finally stood up. He smoothed the front of his blazer, moving with that lazy, predatory grace. He stepped onto the scattered porcelain. The shards crunched under his expensive leather shoes. He didn't stop. He walked directly toward the jagged piece of plate she held, trembling in her fist. "Don't come any closer," Nora shrieked, pressing herself backward until the wood of the bed frame dug into her spine. Cassian stopped when the tip of the porcelain shard was barely an inch from the center of his chest. He looked down at her shaking hand, then up into her wide, panicked eyes. "Are you going to stab me, Nora?" he asked. His voice was a velvet rasp. It didn't hold a trace of fear. It held curiosity. "I will," she sobbed, though the lie tasted like ash in her mouth. She couldn't even kill a spider in her apartment. The thought of driving a piece of broken dishware into human flesh made her stomach roll. "You won't," Cassian corrected gently. He stepped forward. The sharp edge of the porcelain pressed against the fine cotton of his shirt, right over his sternum. Nora whimpered, trying to pull her hand back, but there was nowhere left to go. "Stop. Please." "You want control," he murmured, leaning down slightly so his face was inches from hers. She could smell the mint on his breath. You broke the plate because the silence was drowning you. You grabbed the weapon because it makes you feel like an active participant in your own capture. But you are not a killer, Nora. You are prey trying to wear a predator's skin. He reached out, his large, warm hand wrapped around her trembling fist. Nora gasped, freezing completely. His grip was absolute. If she fought him, the shard would slice her own palm open. "If you want to draw blood," Cassian whispered, his pale eyes burning into hers, "you have to mean it." He tightened his grip on her hand and pushed it forward, driving the tip of the porcelain through his shirt and into his own chest. Nora screamed, a short, sharp sound of horror. She felt the resistance of his skin, followed by a slight pop as the jagged edge broke the surface. A dark crimson spot immediately blossomed on the pristine white cotton. She let go of the shard as if it were white-hot iron. It hung there for a second, embedded in his skin, before dropping to the floor with a clatter. Cassian didn't even grimace. He looked down at the blood blooming across his sternum, then back at Nora. She was hyperventilating, pressing her hands against her mouth, her eyes fixed on the red stain. "See?" Cassian said, his voice terrifyingly steady. "You don't want to hurt me. You just want to survive me." He reached into his pocket, pulled out a stark white handkerchief, and pressed it casually against his chest. "Clean yourself up, Nora. Take a shower. Wash your hair. You smell like fear." He turned and walked toward the door, his leather soles crunching over the ruined plate. Where are you going?" she stammered, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. The thought of him leaving her alone with the mess, with the terrifying realization of what he had just done, was suddenly unbearable. Cassian paused at the door, glancing back over his shoulder. The blood was already soaking through the handkerchief. "I have business to attend to, and you have a shower to take. When you are clean, Dominic will come for you. The isolation phase is over." The hot water scalding her skin was the first genuine physical sensation she had felt in a week that wasn't pain or cold. Nora stood under the rain showerhead in the marble bathroom, leaning heavily against the tile wall. The water rushed over her, turning the lather of the eucalyptus soap a muddy grey as it washed away the sweat, the grime, and the lingering scent of the basement. She scrubbed her skin until it was bright red and stinging. She scrubbed as if she could peel away the memory of Cassian wrapping his hand around hers and forcing her to stab him. "You just want to survive me." He was right. It was the most sickening part. She hadn't felt triumph when the porcelain pierced his skin. She had felt absolute, gut-wrenching terror. She didn't want to defeat him. She just wanted him to stop looking at her like she was a puzzle waiting to be disassembled. When she stepped out of the shower, her legs were weak. She dried off with a towel so thick it felt like a heavy blanket. Sitting on the bathroom vanity was a stack of clean clothes. They hadn't been there when she walked in. Dominic must have slipped in while the water was running. The violation made her skin crawl, but she put them on anyway. It was a pair of fitted black trousers, soft but structured, and a dark green silk blouse. The fabric slid over her skin like water. It wasn't loungewear, it was armor. She walked back into the main room. The shattered porcelain was gone. The gravy stain had been scrubbed from the wall. The room was perfectly sterile again, as if her rebellion had never happened. The heavy lock clicked. Nora turned, bracing herself. Dominic stood in the doorway. He didn't carry a tray. He simply stared at her, then gave a sharp jerk of his head toward the hallway. She was leaving the room. Her heart kicked against her ribs, a frantic, syncopated rhythm. She walked toward the door, her bare feet silent on the hardwood. As she crossed the threshold, the air shifted. The sterile chill of her room gave way to a warmer, richer atmosphere. The hallway was wide, illuminated by dim, amber sconces spaced evenly along the walls. The floor was covered in a thick, sound-absorbing runner. It smelled of expensive cigars, old paper, and a faint hint of bourbon. It smelled like him. Dominic walked a few paces behind her, a silent, hulking shadow, ensuring she didn't bolt for the elevator she spotted at the far end of the corridor. He directed her toward a set of heavy double oak doors. He pushed one open and gestured for her to enter. Nora stepped inside. It was a massive office. One wall was entirely lined with leather-bound books. Another featured the same floor-to-ceiling bulletproof glass as her room, overlooking the sprawling, glittering expanse of the city at night. The lighting was low, focused primarily on a massive mahogany desk in the center of the room. Cassian sat behind the desk. He had changed his shirt. A fresh, crisp black button-down hugged his frame. The top two buttons were undone, but there was no sign of a bandage beneath the fabric. He was speaking quietly into a sleek, black phone pressed to his ear. He glanced up when she entered. His pale eyes swept over her, taking in the dark green silk, the damp hair pulled tightly back from her face, the way she held her arms rigidly at her sides. He didn't stop talking. He gestured with a pen toward a deep leather Chesterfield sofa positioned against the wall, off to the side of his desk. Nora hesitated, looking back at the open door. Dominic had vanished, pulling the heavy wood shut behind him with a soft click. She was trapped again. She walked over to the sofa and sat down on the very edge of the cushion. The leather groaned softly beneath her weight. "I don't care what Garrett promised them," Cassian said into the phone. His voice wasn't the dense, hypnotic hum he used with her. It was flat, devoid of any inflection. It was the voice of a machine calculating a trajectory. The Port Authority was paid for Tuesday. If the shipment isn't clear by midnight, Garrett doesn't get a warning. He gets a visit. Nora stared at her hands, her heart pounding. Garrett. Whoever he was, the total apathy in Cassian's voice made Nora's stomach clench. He was talking about someone's life the way a normal person talked about returning a defective toaster. There was a pause as the person on the other end spoke. Cassian picked up a heavy crystal tumbler from his desk, the amber liquid inside swirling lazily. "No," Cassian replied. "Don't break his legs. It's messy and it takes too long to heal. Cut his Achilles, left leg only. He'll still be able to run the books, but he won't be able to run away." Nora's breath hitched. She squeezed her eyes shut, pressing her nails into her palms. The casual brutality was suffocating. She could almost hear the sound of a tendon snapping, could smell the copper scent of blood returning to haunt her. Cassian hung up the phone without another word. He set it down on the desk, the soft clatter loud in the quiet room. "You look tense, Nora," he noted. She opened her eyes. He was watching her again, taking a slow sip of his bourbon. You're a monster," she whispered. She hadn't meant to say it out loud, but the horror of the phone call had stripped away her filter. Cassian smiled. It was that same razor-thin smile from the basement. "A monster is a chaotic beast driven by instinct. I am deeply organized. There is a difference. You just ordered someone to be crippled. Garrett stole from the ledger. Actions have consequences. It is the only way a fragile ecosystem survives." He set the glass down. "But you didn't steal from me, Nora. Your brother did. So why am I still here?" she pleaded, leaning forward. "You've broken me. You've watched me panic. You've proved your point. What else is there?" Cassian stood up. He walked around the desk, his movements slow, deliberate. Nora's muscles locked up. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to scramble over the back of the sofa. But the memory of his grip on her hand with the porcelain shard kept her paralyzed. He stopped right in front of her, the toes of his shoes inches from hers. He reached down. Nora squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for a blow. Instead, he grasped her chin. His fingers were cool, his thumb resting gently against the pulse point on her jaw. He tilted her head up until she was forced to open her eyes and look at him. "What else is there?" he murmured, his face so close she could feel the heat radiating from his skin. "There is the unraveling, Nora. You've stopped fighting the cage. Now, we see what happens when you start depending on the person holding the key." Rain slashed across the reinforced glass of the penthouse, a frantic, rhythmic drumming that vibrated through the heavy soles of Nora's bare feet. Weeks had bled into a singular, elongated state of existence. She no longer bothered tracking the days. The outside world, the city crawling with microscopic brake lights and tiny, hurried lives, felt like a television show left running in another room. Her reality had shrunk to the square footage of the penthouse, the exact temperature of the conditioned air, and the agonizingly slow cadence of Cassian's footsteps. He allowed her out of the guest room now. The deadbolt remained unlatched during the day, a silent psychological shift that terrified Nora more than the confinement. Confinement was a clear rule. The open door was a test. She spent the first 3 days sitting on her mattress, staring at the brass handle, waiting for a trap to spring. When hunger finally drove her out, she found the kitchen vast, gleaming with stainless steel and entirely empty of knives. Cassian was institutionalizing her. He wasn't doing it with chains or beatings. He was doing it through absolute, suffocating control over her environment, paired with moments of devastating proximity. She stood by the window in his study, the dark green silk blouse clinging to her skin in the cool air. The study smelled of him, a heavy, masculine blend of aged paper, cigar smoke, and that persistent, metallic undertone of ozone. "You are clenching your jaw," Cassian observed. He was sitting at his mahogany desk, a heavy fountain pen scratching across a piece of thick parchment. He hadn't looked up. He never seemed to need to look at her to know exactly what her body was doing. Nora forced her teeth apart. A dull ache throbbed in her temples. "It's the storm," she lied, her voice quiet. It was no longer hoarse, but she had lost the habit of speaking loudly. There was no need to shout in a cage. Cassian set the pen down. The soft click echoed off the leather-bound books lining the walls. He leaned back in his chair, steepling his long fingers beneath his chin. "You are adapting, Nora, but your body is still trying to process the residual cortisol. You sleep, but you don't rest. You eat, but you don't taste. You are waiting for the basement." Nora turned away from the glass. She looked at him, hating the way her heart executed a familiar, pathetic stutter step, just from his focus, shifting to her. "Will I ever go back there?" It was the first time she had asked the question directly. The fear of the answer had kept it lodged in her throat for weeks. Cassian's pale blue eyes locked onto hers. They were entirely void of warmth, a pair of ice floes drifting in a frozen sea. "That depends entirely on you. The basement is for raw material. You are no longer raw. You are in the kiln." He stood up and walked toward a crystal decanter resting on a side table. He poured 2 fingers of amber liquid into a heavy glass. He didn't offer her any. He never did. The deprivation of simple courtesies was another tool, a constant reminder of the hierarchy. "Come here," he commanded softly. Nora hesitated. Her muscles coiled, the deep-seated flight instinct flaring, hot and bright, but her bare feet moved against the hardwood floor. She walked across the expansive study until she was standing inches from him. The physical proximity always made her dizzy. He was so much larger than her, a dense mass of coiled violence wrapped in expensive tailoring. He reached out and took her left hand. Nora flinched, sucking in a sharp breath. She squeezed her eyes shut. Cassian didn't strike her. He didn't twist her arm. He simply held her hand in his thumb tracing the thick, shiny pink scars that ringed her wrists, the permanent souvenirs from the plastic zip ties. His touch was feather-light, a terrifying contrast to the brutality that had caused the wounds. "They are healing," he murmured, his breath brushing the top of her head. "They pull when I stretch," she whispered, unable to stop the truth from spilling out. The contradiction in her mind was a physical sickness. She wanted to rip her hand away. She wanted to scream at him that he was the monster who put those scars there. But another, darker part of her, the part he was methodically carving out and polishing, craved the contact. It was the only touch she had felt in a month. Cassian pressed his thumb harder into the scar tissue. A sharp, stinging pain shot up Nora's forearm. She gasped, her eyes flying open, but she didn't pull away. She stood perfectly still, her chest heaving, staring up at him. "Good," Cassian said, a dark satisfaction blooming in his eyes. "You understand the difference between pain that breaks and pain that anchors. You are learning to hold your ground." He dropped her hand. The sudden absence of his grip left her skin feeling cold and hollow. He walked back to his desk, picking up the glass of bourbon. "Dominic is bringing something up," Cassian said casually, taking a sip. "It is time to balance the final ledger." Nora's stomach plummeted. The air in the study suddenly felt too thin to breathe. The final ledger. Her brother. The heavy oak doors of the study opened with a quiet groan. Dominic stepped inside. The massive enforcer carried a matte black laptop under one arm. He didn't look at Nora. He never looked at her. To Dominic, she was a piece of furniture that Cassian had inexplicably decided to keep. He set the laptop on the center of the mahogany desk, opened the screen, and tapped a few keys. A stark, white light spilled from the monitor, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Dominic stepped back, folding his thick arms across his chest. Cassian gestured toward the screen. "Look, Nora." Nora's feet felt like lead blocks. She walked slowly toward the desk, her eyes fixed on the glowing rectangle. The video feed was grainy, struggling with a low bandwidth connection. The audio hummed with a hollow, metallic echo. It was the interior of a dilapidated warehouse. Concrete floors, rusted support beams, the sickly yellow glare of a portable construction light. And in the center of the frame, tied to a metal folding chair, was Leo. Nora grabbed the edge of the mahogany desk, her knuckles turning white. The breath caught in her throat, a jagged lump of ice. Leo looked terrible. His face was a swollen, purple mass of contusions. One of his eyes was swollen completely shut, weeping a steady stream of clear fluid and blood. His lip was split, his chin stained with dried, flaking crimson. He was sobbing, his chest heaving violently against the thick ropes binding him to the chair. "Please!" Leo's voice crackled through the laptop speakers, tinny and pathetic. "I told you I don't have it! I spent it! But I can get more! Just give me a week! Give me 3 days!" The sound of his voice hit Nora like a physical blow. It was the same voice that used to read her comic books when they were kids. But it was also the voice that had called the bank, pretending to be their father, forging her signature on the loan documents. "He owes me $30,000, Cassian said quietly, stepping up to stand right behind her. He didn't touch her, but she could feel the heat radiating from his body. Plus the cost of my men tracking him through 4 states. But money is an abstract concept, Nora. It doesn't bleed. It doesn't scream. Nora couldn't tear her eyes away from the screen. A dark-clad man walked into the frame, holding a heavy steel wrench. Leo shrieked, thrashing against the ropes, nearly tipping the chair over. "No, no, please! I have a sister. She works. She has money. Go to her. She'll pay it. She'll pay it, I swear." The words echoed in the sterile silence of the penthouse study. Nora stopped breathing. The blood roared in her ears, a rushing torrent that drowned out the rain hitting the glass. She'll pay it. He was doing it again. Right now, sitting in his own puddle of blood, facing down a steel wrench, Leo's very first instinct was to offer her up to the wolves to save his own skin. He didn't know she was already here. He didn't know she had already spent a night screaming on a concrete floor because of him. He was just throwing her under the bus, casually, desperately, without a second thought. The sickening wave of familial love and pity that had initially washed over her evaporated, replaced by a cold, black rage. It was a terrifying emotion. It wasn't the hot, panicked terror of the basement. It was dense. It was heavy. It felt exactly like the tone of Cassian's voice. "Look at him," Cassian whispered, leaning in so his lips were mere inches from her ear. "He traded your safety for his own comfort. He forged your name. He handed you to monsters, hoping we would be satisfied with your bones. And now, he offers you again." Nora's chest rose and fell in a slow, controlled rhythm. The shaking in her hands had stopped completely. "What do you want me to do?" she asked. Her voice was flat, devoid of the frantic edge that usually laced her words. Cassian paused. He looked down at her, a flicker of genuine surprise crossing his rigid features before settling into dark amusement. The conditioning had taken hold deeper and faster than he had anticipated. "The ledger requires balance," Cassian said, resting a hand lightly on her shoulder. The weight of it felt less like a threat and more like an anchor. "I took your terror, Nora. I took your freedom. Because of him. I am offering you the pen. You write the final entry." He reached over and tapped a key on the laptop. The audio on the other end clicked, indicating the microphone was live. "Tell them," Cassian ordered softly. Nora stared at her brother's ruined face. She remembered the smell of the bleach. She remembered the feeling of the plastic cutting into her skin, the utter, devastating realization that nobody was coming to save her. Leo had put her in that basement. Leo had handed her to a psychopath. She leaned closer to the laptop microphone. "Leo." On the screen, Leo froze. His swollen eye darted frantically around the empty warehouse. "Nora! Nora, is that you? Oh my God, Nora, help me! They're going to kill me! Transfer the money, just give them whatever you have!" Nora's expression remained perfectly smooth. The internal contradiction was gone. She didn't feel like a victim anymore. In this terrible, twisted moment, she held the power of life and death, and the sickness of it was intoxicating. "I don't have the money, Leo," she said evenly, her voice echoing out of the warehouse speakers on the feed. "And even if I did, I wouldn't pay it." "What? Nora, please! They're going to break my legs," Leo screamed, his voice cracking into a shrill, animalistic pitch. Nora looked up at Cassian. He was watching her with an expression of pure, unadulterated fascination. He was looking at her the way a creator looks at a masterpiece. She looked back at the screen. "I know," Nora said into the microphone. "Make sure it's both of them." She reached out and pressed the mute button. On the screen, the man with the steel wrench stepped forward. The feed was silent now, a pantomime of extreme violence. Nora watched the wrench swing downward. She watched Leo's mouth stretch open in a silent, agonizing scream. She watched his body arch violently against the ropes as the steel connected with his kneecap. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She watched until the man swung a second time, shattering the other leg, leaving Leo a slumping, unconscious mess in the chair. Cassian reached over and closed the laptop. The screen went black. The only sound in the room was the drumming of the rain. He didn't speak. He simply lifted his glass of bourbon and took a slow, deliberate sip, his pale eyes burning into hers. The message was clear. She had passed the test. She had severed the last tether to her old life. She had chosen the dark. The aftermath of violence possesses a distinct gravity. It settles over a room like invisible ash, thickening the air, forcing every breath to carry its weight. Nora stood perfectly still as Dominic stepped forward, retrieved the closed laptop without a word, and walked out of the study. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind him, sealing her in with Cassian. She expected to feel guilt. She expected her knees to buckle, expected the horrific reality of what she had just ordered to crash down on her and shatter her newfound composure. But the crash never came. Instead, there was only a chilling, hollow quiet inside her chest. The chaotic, frantic girl who had begged for her life on a dirty concrete floor was dead. In her place stood a woman who understood the ruthless arithmetic of Cassian's world. Cassian set his empty glass on the desk. He walked around the mahogany imposing structure, moving with that slow, deliberate grace, until he stood in front of her. "It is done," he stated softly. "Is he dead?" Nora asked, her voice completely devoid of inflection. "No. He will wake up in an alley behind a free clinic in Miami. He will walk with a cane for the rest of his life. But he will breathe. The debt is settled. The ledger is balanced." Cassian turned his back on her. He walked out of the study, his leather shoes silent on the thick runner in the hallway. He didn't tell her to follow, but she did. The invisible tether connecting them pulled taut, dragging her in his wake. He led her through the sprawling penthouse, past the sterile guest room where she had spent weeks losing her mind, past the gleaming, empty kitchen, until they reached the foyer. The foyer was a vast expanse of polished black marble, dominated by a pair of heavy, brushed steel doors. The private elevator. The only way in or out. Cassian stopped at a silver keypad mounted on the wall. He punched in a 6-digit code. A green light flared, accompanied by a heavy mechanical thunk as the primary deadbolt disengaged. He pressed the call button. A soft, melodic chime echoed in the marble space. The steel doors slid open silently, revealing the wood-paneled interior of the elevator cab. Cassian stepped back, gesturing toward the open doors. "You're free to go, Nora," he said, his tone entirely conversational, as if he were holding the door for a guest after a pleasant dinner party. "The debt was Leo's. You settled it. You have no further obligations to me or to my organization." Nora froze. The air spilling out of the elevator shaft was noticeably colder than the conditioned air of the penthouse. It smelled different. It smelled of ozone, damp concrete, and the faint, sour tang of city smog. It smelled like the real world. She stared at the empty cab. Run, the instinct flickered, a weak, dying ember in the back of her brain. She pictured her small, cramped apartment. She pictured the peeling wallpaper, the stack of past-due bills on the counter, the annoying hum of the cheap refrigerator. She pictured walking down the street, going to the grocery store, standing in line behind normal people who worried about the weather and traffic and the price of eggs. A profound, suffocating wave of nausea washed over her. She couldn't go back. How could she possibly stand in a grocery checkout line, knowing what she knew now? How could she smile at a barista when she knew the exact sound a steel wrench makes when it shatters a human kneecap. The mundane world wasn't a sanctuary anymore. It was an alien landscape filled with soft, ignorant people who had no idea how quickly the floor could drop out from underneath them. They would look at her and see a victim. They would see a traumatized girl who needed therapy and pity. She slowly turned her head and looked at Cassian. He stood a few feet away, his hands resting casually in his trouser pockets. He wasn't glaring. He wasn't threatening her. He was simply watching her with that clinical, absolute focus. He didn't see a victim. He saw the woman who had looked into the abyss and ordered it to swallow her brother. He saw the only person who had survived his psychological dismantling and allowed herself to be rebuilt in his image. Nora looked back at the elevator. The doors were programmed to stay open for exactly 30 seconds. 20 seconds. The soft hum of the cab's ventilation fan filled the silence. 10 seconds. The cold air raised goosebumps on her bare arms. "Where would I go?" Nora whispered, her voice barely carrying over the hum. "Anywhere you like," Cassian replied smoothly. "You survived. You earned your life back." "It's not my life anymore," she said, turning to face him fully. The dark green silk of her blouse rustled softly. She looked at his hands, the hands that had held her throat, the hands that had brought her food, the hands that had forced her to hold the broken porcelain. She stepped backward, away from the cold draft of the elevator shaft. 5 seconds. She walked past Cassian, the scent of bergamot and gunpowder washing over her, wrapping around her like a heavy protective blanket. She walked to the steel doors, reached out, and pressed her hand against the cold metal edge of the frame. She didn't push herself inside. She simply waited. A sharp warning beep sounded. The steel doors slid shut with a heavy, final clack. The green light on the keypad blinked out, replaced by a solid, unyielding red. Nora stood in the quiet foyer, staring at her faint reflection in the brushed steel. She looked the same, but the eyes staring back at her were entirely empty of fear. The cage door was locked, but this time she was on the inside by choice. She heard the soft rustle of fabric behind her. Cassian stepped up close, his chest brushing against her back. He didn't wrap his arms around her. There was no romantic embrace, no sweeping declaration of twisted love. He simply leaned down, resting his chin lightly near her temple, his breath warm against her skin. "I knew you wouldn't leave," he whispered, his voice a dense, vibrating purr that settled deep into her bones. "The basement broke you, Nora, but the penthouse made you mine." Nora closed her eyes, leaning back infinitesimally against the solid wall of his chest. The Contran was finally dead. She didn't hate him anymore. She didn't fear him. She had simply become part of the darkness, a permanent shadow in his sterile, gilded cage. And as he reached around her to double-check the lock on the deadbolt, Nora exhaled a long, steady breath, realizing with absolute, terrifying clarity that she had never felt safer. And that brings us to the chilling end of Nora's descent. If her final, unsettling choice left a knot in your stomach, or if you found yourself morbidly fascinated by Cassian's terrifying psychology, hit that like button right now. It tells the algorithm you crave more unfiltered, psychological dark romance. Don't forget to share this video with fellow dark fiction lovers and subscribe with the notification bell turned on so you never miss our next descent into the shadows. What would you have done when those elevator doors opened? Sound off in the comments below. See you next time.